The lake had gone the color of pewter by the time the supply wagon reached the end of the track, and the spruce along the shore stood close together, like men deciding something. She watched them from the wagon box, the canvas bag on her lap, the letter from the post office, folded small in her coat pocket, folded enough times that the paper had begun to soften at the creases, the way paper does when you have read it too many times to pretend you aren't memorizing it. The man who had brought her out from Birchford hadn't spoken much beyond telling her which ruts to brace for. She was grateful for that. She had been in Canada 14 months and had learned that the people here measured the quality of silence differently than people had back home. Back home, silence between strangers meant suspicion. Here, in the north, it seemed to mean something closer to respect. The settlement came into view around a stand of birch. It wasn't large enough to call a town. A mill at the water's edge, a feed store, 2 houses set back from the shore road, and at the far end, a workshop with a good chimney putting out steady smoke. A carpenter's workshop, she assumed, because the notice had said carpenter, and the smoke meant someone was working, and work meant the man she had come to find. The wagon stopped at the feed store. A woman came out onto the step, McCrae's wife, she would learn later, though at this moment she was simply a woman in a gray apron who looked at her with the frank, assessing expression of someone who already knew why she was there. "You'll be looking for the carpenter," the woman said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. The woman nodded toward the workshop at the end of the road. "He'll hear you if you knock on the side door. Fronts for storage." She thanked her, picked up her bag, and walked. The road was frozen at the surface but soft underneath, and her boots broke through the crust with each step. It was that particular November cold, not yet the hard cold that settled in and stayed, but the cold that was still deciding. She had her coat buttoned to the top and her hands in her pockets, and she walked without hurrying, because hurrying would not make the workshop any closer, and it would not make whatever was about to happen any easier. She heard him before she reached the door. The sound of a plane moving along wood, a long, continuous draw followed by a pause, then another draw. She had grown up with that sound. Her father had been a carpenter in the years before his hands gave out, and the rhythm of it was one of those sounds that goes directly into the body without stopping in the mind first. She knocked on the side door. The planing stopped. A moment, then the door opened. He was younger than she had expected from his letters. Or not younger exactly, but the weathered quality she had prepared herself for was different in person. The lines around his eyes were from squinting at close work, not from hardship, or not only from hardship. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have been half certain about and are now having to revise. He said, "You came." 2 words. She had taken a train from Halifax to Winnipeg, and then a local to Birchford, and then a supply wagon 3 hours north along a logging track, and he said, "You came." She said, "I came." He stepped back from the door to let her in. The workshop smelled of spruce shavings and linseed oil, and the particular warmth of a wood stove that had been running since early morning. Along the left wall, boards stacked by width. Along the right, the workbench, its surface worn pale in the center where years of projects had been steadied. He had been making a chair. She could see the legs laid out on the bench, each one turned slightly different from the last, which meant he was still working toward the shape he wanted, rather than repeating one he already knew. She did not say anything about the chair. He said, "The house is across the road. I'll take you once I've put the stove down." "All right," she said. She waited near the door while he banked the fire. He moved through the steps with the ease of a man who has done the same thing 10,000 times. Damper adjusted, draft closed, a last check of the ash pan. His movements had no performance in them. He was not aware of being watched, or if he was, he had decided it wasn't his concern. She watched him anyway. The house was 100 steps from the workshop, which she noted and filed away because the woman in the gray apron had told her, with the particular weight of someone passing on useful information, that the man worked long hours and didn't like to be interrupted at it. 100 steps was close enough to hear a hammer, far enough to be separate. He held the door and she went in ahead of him. The room was orderly in the way that a working man's room is orderly when he has made the effort. Everything placed, nothing wasted. A table with 2 chairs, a cook stove already cold for the evening, shelves above the dry sink with a tin coffee pot, and 4 cups, which she noted because 4 meant he had considered having people at the table, or had once, or had inherited them from someone who had braided rug on the floor, slightly off-center, as though it had been moved once and not moved back. And in the corner by the window, asleep in a chair with his legs hanging over the armrest, and a gray cat pressed against his side, a boy of about 7 years. She looked at the boy and then at the man. He said, "That's Finn, my brother's son. He came last spring." He said it without elaboration, the way you say a fact that has its own weight behind it and doesn't need more weight added. She looked at the boy, the fallen open mouth, the cat's paw curled against his hip. "Does he wake easily?" she asked. "No," he said. "A tree could come down on the roof." He moved to the stove and crouched to open the firebox. She set her bag down near the door, not yet fully in the room, and looked around at what she had come to. A practical house. Enough in the kitchen corner to do real work with. She could see the flour bin, a covered crock that was probably lard, a row of canned goods on the lowest shelf. Someone had thought about the stores, even if the thinking hadn't extended much beyond them. She took off her coat and looked for a hook. There were 2 by the door. One held his coat. She put hers on the other and stood a moment with her hands at her sides. "I can start on supper," she said, "if there's something you'd want." He looked up from the fire. "There's salt pork in the crock, and I think there's still potatoes in the box behind the door." "That's enough," she said. He did not offer to help. She did not expect him to. She found the potatoes and the salt pork and a cast-iron pan that had been seasoned properly and kept that way, which told her something about him that the letters hadn't. She worked without asking where anything was, finding it instead. The knife, the cutting board, the small tin of dried thyme on the second shelf. She was not performing. She simply knew what she was doing, and there was a relief in that, in being in a kitchen with actual work in front of her after the weeks of waiting. Finn woke when the smell reached him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with the cat under one arm and his hair standing up on the left side, and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a child who has learned that new adults in his life are neither good nor bad until proven otherwise. "Are you the lady who's going to cook?" he asked. "I am," she said. He considered this. "Do you know how to make fritters?" "I do." He nodded as though she had passed something and came to sit at the table. The cat jumped down and disappeared. He watched her work with the focused attention of someone cataloging information. She did not try to charm him. She cooked, and he watched, and by the time the food was on the table, they had established something between them that was not yet familiarity, but was not wariness either. The man came in when she called. He washed his hands at the basin and sat down. She put the food in front of him and then sat across from him and put her hands flat on the table, the way she had done since childhood when she needed to steady herself for something she wasn't certain of. Finn talked through most of the meal. About the cat, about the mill, about a boy named Beryl at the feed store who had told him there were wolves near the North Shore. The man listened and occasionally corrected a point of fact without shutting the story down. She ate and listened and did not contribute more than was natural. She was still learning the shape of the room. After supper, the man said he had work in the workshop for another hour. Finn showed her where the loft was, a steep ladder and a room with a low ceiling and a window that faced east. A cot, a folded blanket, a small table beside it, clean. Someone had swept it recently. The evidence was in the corners, which still held a fine layer of the sawdust that was everywhere in this house. Everywhere in this settlement, probably. But the center of the floor was clear. She set her bag at the foot of the cot and sat a moment in the quiet. Downstairs, Finn was talking to the cat. Outside, she could hear the workshop through the cold. The long draw of the plane resumed, regular as breathing. She had slept in worse places. She had slept in rooms where she wasn't certain of the morning. She pulled the blanket over herself and listened to the plane moving in the dark. And that was the end of the first night. In the morning, she came down to find Finn at the table with a piece of bread and the cat in his lap and a pot of coffee on the hook above the banked coals, still warm. The man was already in the workshop. She could hear him. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the birch grove at the edge of the yard. The light was coming in low and pale through the trees, the way November light came in up here, not warm but clean, with a quality that made everything look considered. The frost on the window glass caught it and held it differently at each hour, and she had been watching it long enough this morning to know that. Finn said, without looking up from his bread, he gets up at 5. Does he? She said. Sometimes 4:30. When he's got a job he wants to finish. She drank her coffee and looked at the birch trees. There were stores enough for a real breakfast. She made porridge because there was oatmeal and because a child needed something warm in his stomach before a morning. And she was not going to pretend she hadn't noticed. The bread was the last of the loaf. She made enough for 3. She left his portion on the back of the stove where it would stay warm without cooking further. He came in at mid-morning. She was mending a tear in Finn's jacket. The boy had appeared with it in hand, and a look that suggested this was something he hoped might get handled without him having to explain how it happened. She had taken it without question. She heard him come in. She did not look up from her work. He saw the porridge on the stove. He stood there a moment before he got it down. She was aware of the pause without watching it. She had learned, growing up in a house with her father, how to read a room without appearing to. He ate standing at the counter. He set the bowl in the basin and went back out without speaking. She did not mind it. The silence had texture to it. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of 2 people who had separately decided that the other one was probably all right. The weeks moved in their own rhythm. She learned the house the way you learn any language. First, the obvious things, then the exceptions. She learned that the cook stove pulled strong on the right side in the morning and had to be damped if you didn't want to scorch what was on the front burner. She learned that Finn left his boots wherever he stepped out of them, and that recovering them before breakfast was simply a feature of mornings. She learned that the man kept 2 good knives in the workshop and 1 in the kitchen, and that if you needed the workshop ones, you could take them without asking, but had to return them by afternoon. She did not learn what was in the tin box on the shelf above the dry sink. It was a tobacco tin, the kind repurposed for holding small things. Buttons, a folded paper, something that rattled faintly when the shelf vibrated. She noticed it the first night, and she had been noticing it every day since. It was not her business. She had not once moved it or touched it, and she was fairly certain she wasn't going to. Finn told her things. About the man, about the settlement, about the way things had been before she came. He told her that his mother had died in April, which was why he was here, and that his uncle had come to get him himself rather than sending word, which Finn seemed to consider significant. He told her that there had been a woman who cooked for them in the summer, but she had gone back to her sister in Portage. He told her that his uncle didn't talk much, but that he was good at listening, which Finn had decided was more important. She listened to all of it and asked nothing that he didn't offer first. One afternoon in the 2nd week, the man stopped in the kitchen doorway, not to come in, just standing there, and said, "I'm going to Farrell's store if you need anything." She was cutting dried apple into a pot. She said, "Thread if he has it, brown or something close." He said, "All right," and left. He came back with brown thread and also a small tin of cinnamon. She had not asked for cinnamon. She had not mentioned cinnamon. She used it in the apple she was stewing and did not say anything about it, and he sat down to supper and did not say anything about it. And Finn ate 2 helpings and asked what was different. "Cinnamon," she said. Finn looked at the man looked at his plate. She looked at neither of them. It was at Farrell's general store, a week after that she began to understand something she had not been letting herself understand. He had taken her with him on the supply run, said, simply that she'd be better off knowing where things were kept. If she ever needed to go herself, she had put on her coat and come. Finn had stayed behind with the cat and a project involving string that he declined to explain. Farrell's was the kind of store that smelled of coal oil and dried goods and the particular dustiness of bolts of fabric that had not been moved in some time. An older man behind the counter, who had the comfortable manner of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by the people who came through his door. She walked along the shelves while the man spoke with Farrell at the counter. She was looking for brown thread and she found it. 2 spools, similar shade, one slightly warmer, and she stood there deciding between them. She took the warmer one. It was the better match for Finn's jacket. The shelf below, she found a spool of dark green wool. Not the right thing for what she needed. Too heavy for mending, the color something between spruce and river ice in March. She picked it up. It was beautiful in an impractical way, the kind of color that makes you hold it longer than you meant to. She set it back. She had no use for dark green wool. She took only the thread to the counter and paid for it herself. He was looking at a seed catalog Farrell had put out. He did not seem to have noticed. They walked back in the thin afternoon light, him carrying the heavier supplies, her carrying the thread. The birch trees along the road had dropped most of their leaves, and the white bark stood out against the gray sky with a clarity that was almost harsh. She had noticed over these weeks that she had stopped finding the landscape austere. It had simply become the landscape. He said, "Cold's coming in tonight." "I thought so," she said. The light had that flatness to it this morning. He looked at her sideways briefly. He looked back at the road. He said after a moment, "I'll check the weather stripping on the north window when we get back. It wasn't sealing right last winter." "All right," she said. That was all. But she had caught it. The brief way he had looked at her when she said something about the light that he hadn't expected her to know. She filed it away with the other things she had been filing. The cold came in hard 2 nights later. She woke to the sound of it, not wind exactly, but the particular pressure of cold against the window glass, the house adjusting to the temperature the way old wood does, settling and tightening all at once. She lay still and listened to it and then heard, below her, the sound of the stove being opened and fed. He was up before the light again. She dressed and came downstairs. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was already on. He was not in the kitchen. She could hear him in the workshop, the hammer now, instead of the plain, shorter strokes, a different job. She made breakfast and sent Finn to knock on the workshop door when it was ready. She watched through the kitchen window as the boy ran across the frozen yard, his breath visible in the cold, his boots leaving small prints in the first thin skin of frost on the grass. When the man came in, she was at the dry sink with her back to the room. She heard him stop. She turned around. He was standing at the shelf above the dry sink. The tin box was where it always was, but beside it, arranged without any ceremony as though they had always been there, were 3 spools of dark green wool. The same color, the same weight, the color between spruce and river ice. She had held it in Farrell's store for perhaps 10 seconds before setting it back. She had not paused long enough for it to mean anything, she had thought. She had not said a word about it. She had not even glanced at it on the walk home. She stood very still. He moved past her to the table and sat down and said to Finn, "What's that you've been building with the string?" Finn launched into an explanation. She turned back to the dry sink. Her hands had gone still. She made herself move them. She poured coffee into his cup and set it on the table and went back to the stove and stood there with her back to both of them and felt something in her chest shift. Not a breaking, not anything dramatic, but the way a room shifts when a door is opened that has been closed a long time, when the air from outside comes in and you realize you had grown so accustomed to the closed air that you had stopped noticing it. She had not been chosen carelessly. She had known it with some part of her mind since the first morning, from the way the house was kept, from the coffee on the hook, from the 4 cups on the shelf. But knowing something and feeling it were different things, and she had been careful, very careful, not to feel anything that couldn't be undone. 3 spools, the same color she had held for 10 seconds and set back down without a word. She ate breakfast at the table with both of them. She listened to Finn explain the string project. She answered his questions when he asked them and drank her coffee and did not look at the shelf. The first snow came before the end of the week. She heard it the way she had always heard first snow. In the quality of the dark before it arrived, a density to the air, a particular stillness that had nothing to do with wind dropping. She lay in the loft and listened to it begin and felt the roof settle faintly under the weight of the first thin layer. In the morning, the yard was white, and Finn was at the window before she was fully awake, pressing his nose to the glass. She came downstairs, and he was already outside in it, making tracks across the yard in every direction with the specific, purposeless joy of a child who has not yet learned to walk through snow economically. The cat sat on the porch rail and watched him with profound skepticism. The man was in the workshop. She could see the smoke from its chimney rising pale against the pale sky. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Finn's tracks spread outward from the door, in every direction, a record of everywhere he had wanted to go at once. After a while, she heard the workshop door and watched him cross the yard. He walked through the snow without paying particular attention to it, heading for the house, and then he stopped. He was looking at something near the east wall of the workshop. She followed his line of sight. Finn had gone through the snow there too, and beside Finn's small erratic tracks were a different kind. The boy had found his uncle's earlier footprints and had been following them, stepping in them, placing each small boot carefully inside the larger impression. He stood looking at that for a moment, just a moment, then he came inside. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and did not say anything. She kept her hands around her cup and looked at the birch trees, which were white now in a different way than before. Not the white of bare bark, but something softer. The snow caught in the smallest forks of the branches. She said, "The step on the north side of the porch has some give to it." He said, "I noticed. I'll see to it once the ground firms up a bit." She nodded. Outside, Finn had started building something in the snow, the beginning of a wall or a fort, the purpose still undecided. His voice carried across the cold air when he called out a question about whether logs or snow bricks were structurally superior, and she could hear in it the particular happiness of a child who has been given a whole morning and no particular instructions about what to do with it. She thought about the green spools on the shelf. She thought about how she had moved through this house over these past weeks, learning its sounds, its drafts, the way the kitchen light came in from the east window at this hour, and how she had done all of it carefully, keeping a kind of interior distance, the way you keep your weight off a floorboard you're not certain of. She was not keeping her weight off it anymore. She could not have said exactly when she had stopped. He set his cup in the basin and turned toward the door, and then paused. He said, without quite looking at her, "Farrell got some flannel in last week, heavier weight. I put a length aside." She looked at him. He was looking at the window. His jaw had the set of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and is waiting to see what comes of it. She said, "For what?" He said, "I don't know, whatever it's needed for, winter's long." He went back to the workshop. She stayed at the window while longer. Finn had organized the snow into something that was clearly a fort now. He had committed to walls. The cat had retreated inside and was sitting on the rug near the stove with an expression of complete moral superiority. She picked up her cup. The coffee had gone cool, but she finished it anyway. She went to the shelf and looked at the 3 green spools. She picked one up and turned it in her hand. The color was exactly what she had thought it was in the store. Something between spruce and river ice, the particular shade of this country in the season between seasons, that hour in March when the snow is still on the ground, but something underneath it has already decided to come through. She had no current use for it. She had no project that called for dark green wool. She set it back down carefully in its place. She looked at the tin box beside the spools. She had been carefully not looking at it for weeks. She looked at it now. The dented lid, the rust along one seam, the kind of box a person keeps when they are not ready to put something away and not able to leave it out in the open. She did not touch it, but she stopped pretending she hadn't noticed it. That much she could do. Outside, Finn called out something about needing reinforcement on the fort's east wall. His voice carried in the clear, cold air, close and very present. She tied on her apron and turned toward the work that was waiting, and the house settled around her in its ordinary sounds. The stove's low tick, the cat resettling on the rug, and across the yard the long draw of the plane starting up again, steady as a heartbeat, the way it had been every morning since she arrived, and the way she now knew, without needing to say it to herself or to anyone else, it would go on being. The snow kept falling, the fort's east wall held. And she was still there, and she had stopped counting the reasons why.